In the grand scheme of galactic civilization, the hegemony of advanced species considered itself the universe's benevolent landlord, the kind that shows up unannounced, criticizes your lawn, and then charges you for the privilege. For roughly 3 million years, this collection of highly evolved races had been making the cosmos a better place, which coincidentally always seemed to involve other species doing exactly what the hegemony wanted. The hegemony's membership read like a who's who of cosmic superiority complexes. The crystalline Ethereals had transcended physical form so completely, they communicated through interpretive light shows that took decades to properly appreciate. The biomechanical Nexus Collective had optimized themselves into perfect efficiency, removing such wasteful concepts as humor, spontaneity, and anything resembling fun. The gaseous wisdom clouds existed as pure intellect, drifting through space dispensing advice nobody asked for with the smugness of a philosophy professor at a dinner party. Together, they had crafted what they modestly called the perfect system, a galactic order where younger species were evaluated, categorized, and either uplifted to acceptable standards, or politely exterminated for the greater good. It was democracy in action, provided you defined democracy as 3 ancient species deciding everyone else's fate over cosmic tea. Their process had become beautifully routine over the millennia. Step 1. Reconnaissance. Step 2. Classification according to the developmental appropriateness scale. Step 3. Either integration or elimination, depending on whether the species showed proper potential for civilization. They'd performed this dance thousands of times with younger races, and it always ended the same way, with grateful submission or convenient extinction. Which brings us to Earth, that unremarkable blue-green marble spinning around an equally unremarkable yellow star, in what the hegemony's star charts diplomatically labeled sector nowhere important. The planet had recently caught their attention not through any particular achievement, but because its inhabitants had finally invented radio waves, and were broadcasting their existence to the cosmos with all the subtlety of a drunk person shouting at a library. Initial scans revealed a species that barely qualified as sentient by hegemony standards. These humans still used physical currency, elected their leaders through popularity contests, and had somehow convinced themselves that reality television constituted entertainment. They fought wars over invisible lines on maps, poisoned their own environment for profit, and had managed to split the atom before figuring out how to split dinner bills fairly. The Ethereals preliminary report was a masterpiece of condescension wrapped in academic language. Subject species demonstrates concerning attachment to illogical emotional responses, it noted, somehow managing to sound bored despite being pure energy. High probability of resistance to logical integration protocol. Recommend standard pacification procedures followed by intensive behavioral modification. The Nexus Collective's analysis was more direct. Species efficiency rating 12.7 out of possible 100. Recommended action: complete restructuring or termination. These creatures actually choose their occupations based on passion rather than optimal resource allocation. Clearly defective. Even the wisdom clouds, usually prone to lengthy philosophical discourse about the nature of existence, kept their assessment brief. They worship invisible beings, fight over whose invisible being is better, then claim their invisible beings want peace. Logic circuits cannot process this contradiction, suggest quick resolution. The humans, blissfully unaware they were being evaluated like a failed science experiment, continued their charmingly chaotic existence. They simultaneously developed space travel and fast food, wrote poetry and instruction manuals for assembling furniture that no sentient being could follow. They created art that moved souls and bureaucracy that crushed them. To the hegemony, humanity represented everything wrong with unguided evolution. They were inefficient, emotional, unpredictable, and worst of all, they seemed genuinely happy with their mess of a civilization. This could not stand. Allowing such a species to develop unchecked would set a terrible precedent for cosmic order. The decision was unanimous and swift. Earth would receive the gift of hegemony guidance, whether it wanted it or not. The operation would be routine, a show of force, a demonstration of superior technology, and then the inevitable submission of yet another primitive species, grateful for the chance to be properly civilized. Fleet Admiral Omnixius, a being whose species had evolved beyond names into mathematical equations, was assigned to oversee the operation. His confidence was absolute, his preparations minimal. After all, How difficult could it be to convince a species that still tied their shoes manually to accept the wisdom of their cosmic betters? The invasion fleet launched on schedule, carrying with it 3 million years of successful precedent and an unshakable belief that humans would follow the same predictable pattern as every other species before them. The universe, apparently, had other plans. As the sleek Hegemony vessels entered Earth's solar system, their crews prepared for what they assumed would be the shortest conquest in galactic history. They could hardly have been more wrong, but then again, arrogance has always been evolution's way of ensuring that even the most advanced species remain capable of spectacular mistakes. The humans, meanwhile, continued being inexplicably human, completely unaware that their cosmic report card had just arrived, and they were about to take the most important test of their species' existence. The Hegemony fleet materialized above Earth, with all the subtle grandeur of a cosmic middle finger. Massive ships, each the size of a small city, hung in orbit like metallic storm clouds, their hulls gleaming with the kind of technological superiority that should have sent any rational species scrambling for their surrender form. These vessels represented millennia of advanced engineering, powered by contained singularities and armed with weapons that could crack planets like walnuts. To the Hegemony, it was their standard "hello, we're here to improve your lives whether you like it or not" greeting card. Fleet Admiral Omnixius reviewed his checklist with the satisfaction of someone following a recipe they'd perfected thousands of times. Step 1. Dramatic arrival. Check. Step 2. Allow primitive species precisely 17 minutes to marvel at their technological superiority. Step 3. Broadcast the standard integration ultimatum in their crude mathematical languages. Step 4. Accept their inevitable surrender with appropriately benevolent condescension. What actually happened was more like watching a perfectly choreographed ballet crash into a food fight. The humans' first response came from their various military installations, and it was diverse. The North Americans immediately assumed it was either the Russians, the Chinese, or possibly an elaborate hoax involving Hollywood special effects. The Russians assumed it was the Americans testing some new psychological warfare technique. The Chinese government spent the first 3 hours trying to determine if this was a profitable business opportunity. Meanwhile, amateur radio operators worldwide began broadcasting everything from classical music to death metal at the alien ships, apparently operating under the theory that the visitors might appreciate a proper welcome playlist. One particularly enterprising group in Australia started taking bets on whether the aliens were friendly, hostile, or just really lost tourists. The chaos only intensified when various world leaders attempted to respond simultaneously. The President of the United States demanded to know why nobody had called him first. The Prime Minister of Britain immediately began drafting a strongly worded letter of complaint about the unauthorized use of their airspace. The Secretary General of the United Nations called an emergency session to debate whether they needed to form a committee to study the formation of a committee to address the situation. Religious leaders worldwide began offering interpretations ranging from the Second Coming to the final proof that their particular deity had been right all along. Stock markets crashed, soared, crashed again, then somehow managed to crash and soar simultaneously. Social media exploded with hashtags, memes, and approximately 14 million different conspiracy theories, 3 of which were accidentally correct. Admiral Omnixius watched this display of human chaos with growing confusion. His tactical algorithms had accounted for fear, immediate surrender, or perhaps futile military resistance. They had not accounted for a species that somehow managed to turn first contact into what appeared to be a combination of a diplomatic incident, a reality show, and a neighborhood barbecue that had gotten completely out of hand. Or they asked his tactical officer, a crystalline being whose light patterns flickered with uncertainty. "I believe some of them are selling commemorative merchandise," reported the communications specialist, whose tentacles writhed in what passed for bewilderment among his species. The situation became more surreal when humans began attempting to communicate with the fleet, using methods ranging from mathematics and prime numbers to interpretive dance performed on football fields. One group projected images of Earth's greatest cultural achievements, the works of Shakespeare, Mozart's symphonies, and for reasons no xenopsychologist would ever adequately explain, every episode of a comedy series about 6 friends drinking coffee. Enter humanity's first unofficial ambassador, Dr. Evelyn Hartford, a xenolinguistics professor, who had spent her career studying theoretical alien communication. She was brilliant, unconventional, and possessed the kind of academic fearlessness that comes from tenure and too much caffeine. While world governments debated protocol, she simply picked up her radio and started talking to the aliens in mathematical sequences, chemical formulas, and basic physics principles. "Hello up there," she broadcast from her university lab. "We're new to this whole galactic neighbor thing, but we brought snacks and we're generally friendly unless you're trying to probe us or steal our water. Also, we're curious about your propulsion systems, your social structures, and whether you've solved the problem of getting gum out of hair." Her colleague, Dr. Bennet Hayes, a quantum physicist with a talent for thinking 7 steps ahead of everyone else, was already running calculations on the aliens' ship configuration. "Their energy signatures are off the charts," he muttered, scribbling equations across 3 whiteboards simultaneously. "But their formation patterns suggest they're following some kind of standardized protocol. Very rigid, very predictable." Meanwhile, Colonel Diana Frost, a military strategist known for her ability to win war games that everyone else considered impossible, was studying the alien ships from a different angle entirely. "Their posturing," she observed to herself. "Look at the formation, it's designed for intimidation, not actual combat efficiency. They expect us to be impressed and scared." "Should we be impressed and scared?" asked her aide. "Probably," Frost admitted, "but they clearly haven't done their homework on humans. We're the species that looked at the ocean and said let's sail across that, looked at the sky and said let's fly through that, and looked at space and said hold my beer. We don't do predictable." The Hegemony's standard integration ultimatum, when it finally arrived, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic condescension. It offered humanity the magnificent opportunity to join galactic civilization, under Hegemony guidance, provided they immediately ceased all inefficient behaviors, submitted to behavioral modification protocols, and accepted the wisdom of their cosmic better. The human response was, in the words of one historian, diplomatically catastrophic and absolutely hilarious. Instead of a unified government response, the aliens received approximately 7,000 different replies. Some were official government responses, ranging from polite interest to militant defiance. Others came from individuals, corporations, religious groups, and at least 3 different science fiction fan clubs, claiming to represent Earth's official welcoming committee. One response that particularly confused the Hegemony came from a group of teenagers who had somehow hacked into the communication frequency and submitted humanity's answer, in the form of memes, emoji, and what appeared to be a poorly translated recipe for pizza. Admiral Omnixia stared at the cascade of contradictory, chaotic, and utterly unpredictable human responses, with the expression of someone who had just discovered their carefully organized filing system had been rearranged by a tornado, with a sense of humor. For the first time in 3 million years of successful galactic management, the Hegemony was completely, utterly, and spectacularly confused. The humans weren't following any known pattern of species behavior. They weren't united enough to surrender properly, weren't organized enough to resist efficiently, and weren't logical enough to make any sense whatsoever. "Sir," reported the communications officer, his tentacles now tied in what could only be described as knots of frustration, "they're asking if we want to participate in something called a cultural exchange program, and whether our species has discovered coffee." The Admiral realized, 3 weeks into what should have been a routine 24-hour pacification, Admiral Omnixis was discovering that humans possessed a truly remarkable talent for turning cosmic order into cosmic chaos. The species that should have been grateful for Hegemony guidance had instead treated the invasion like an all-you-can-learn buffet of alien technology, a diplomatic puzzle game, and apparently the universe's most elaborate practical joke. Evelyn Hartford had somehow convinced the Ethereals to engage in what she called philosophical discourse, but which resembled more of an academic interrogation disguised as friendly conversation. While the energy beings smugly explained the superiority of their transcendent existence, Hartford was quietly mapping their communication protocols, energy frequencies, and what appeared to be their species' equivalent of emotional triggers. "Fascinating," she would murmur, furiously taking notes while the Ethereals preened in their light-form equivalent of intellectual superiority. "So you've eliminated all physical constraints, but you still organize yourselves hierarchically, and you still feel the need to explain your superiority to lesser beings. How wonderfully efficient. The Ethereals, who had evolved past recognizing sarcasm, interpreted this as genuine admiration and continued revealing increasingly detailed information about Hegemony structure, technology, and most importantly their weaknesses. They had no idea they were being professionally dissected by someone whose doctoral thesis had been on extracting cultural information from minimally cooperative subjects. Meanwhile, Bennet Hayes had gone from calculating alien energy signatures to actively reverse engineering Hegemony technology through the simple expedient of asking really good questions. The Nexus Collective, proud of their perfect efficiency, couldn't resist explaining exactly how their systems worked when faced with what they perceived as genuine intellectual curiosity. Your power distribution network, Hayes would say, sketching diagrams that looked suspiciously accurate. It must require incredible coordination to maintain such efficiency across multiple ship systems simultaneously. The redundancy protocols alone must. He would trail off, looking confused and impressed, while the collective smugly filled in the technical details he was pretending not to understand. Within 2 weeks, Hayes had mapped roughly 60% of Hegemony fleet vulnerabilities, identified their power source specification, and figured out that their mighty warships had been designed by committee and possessed all the tactical flexibility of a very large, very expensive paperweight. Colonel Diana Frost, however, was playing an entirely different game. While the scientists gathered intelligence, she was conducting what military historians would later call aggressive psychological fieldwork. Every human response to the Hegemony had been carefully orchestrated to present the aliens with a single consistent message. Humans were absolutely, completely, and utterly unpredictable. The resistance movements that spontaneously erupted worldwide appeared random and chaotic, but they were anything but. Each group used different tactics, different technologies, and different approaches, creating a pattern that wasn't a pattern. Urban guerrillas in New York operated completely differently from rural resistance cells in Montana, who bore no resemblance to the cyber warfare specialists in Seoul or the diplomatic saboteurs in Geneva. They expect us to be logical, Frost explained to her growing network of military coordinators worldwide. Every species they've conquered has followed predictable patterns, either immediate submission or organized resistance that follows standard tactical doctrine. We're going to give them something that doesn't exist in their databases: coordinated chaos. The beauty of Frost's strategy was that it didn't require humans to be something they weren't. Humans were naturally chaotic, naturally independent, and naturally inclined to approach problems from completely different angles simultaneously. She simply organized this chaos into a weapon. When Hegemony forces attempted to establish guidance centers in major cities, they found themselves dealing with protests that somehow combined elements of street festivals, academic conferences, and what appeared to be competitive performance art. Humans showed up with everything from scientific questions to folk music, creating situations that required 17 different types of specialists to address and somehow still made no sense. The aliens advanced psychological warfare protocols, designed to break the morale of primitive species, instead encountered humans who treated the entire situation like the most interesting thing that had ever happened to them. Fear and fascination weren't supposed to coexist in the same species, yet humans managed both simultaneously, while somehow adding curiosity, stubborn defiance, and an inexplicable urge to offer their alien invaders local cuisine. But the real revelation came when humanity's learning curve kicked into high gear. The species that the Hegemony had dismissed as primitive began demonstrating an adaptation rate that defied every model in their xenobiological database. Humans weren't just learning about alien technology, they were improving it. Hayes's reverse engineering project had evolved into active innovation. Human engineers were taking Hegemony designs and asking uncomfortable questions, like why does this need 17 different components when 3 would work better? And has anyone considered that this entire system is unnecessarily complicated? They began producing hybrid technologies that combined human ingenuity with alien materials, creating devices that were somehow both more efficient and more user-friendly than the originals. The psychological impact on the Hegemony was devastating. The Ethereals, confronted with humans who had turned philosophical discussion into espionage, began experiencing what could only be described as existential anxiety. The Nexus Collective, faced with creatures who casually improved their perfect systems, suffered the mechanical equivalent of nervous breakdown. The wisdom clouds found themselves dispensing advice to humans who politely listened, took notes, and then did something completely different that worked better. "Sir," reported Admiral Omnixius's tactical officer, her light patterns now flickering in patterns that suggested deep confusion, "the humans have somehow weaponized curiosity. They're treating our invasion like a learning opportunity, and they're getting stronger," added the communications specialist, whose tentacles had developed a nervous twitch. "Every day they understand our systems better. Every interaction teaches them something new. They're not being broken by our presence. They're being enhanced by it." The most disturbing reports came from Hegemony forces stationed planet-side. Humans weren't just resisting, they were befriending their occupiers, learning from them, and somehow converting them into unwitting teachers. Several Nexus Collective units had begun experiencing what their programming identified as inappropriate emotional responses after extended exposure to human illogic. 2 ethereal entities had requested transfers to other sectors, claiming that humans made them uncomfortable in ways their transcendent existence wasn't supposed to allow. Admiral Omnixius stared at the mounting reports and realized he was facing something unprecedented in Hegemony history, a species that was using the invasion to level up. The humans weren't being conquered, they were being educated, and educated humans, as the galaxy was about to learn, were considerably more dangerous than ignorant ones. "Sir," his aide ventured carefully, "perhaps we should consider updating our assessment of human threat potential." The Admiral looked at the tactical displays showing human resistance cells that operated like think tanks, diplomats who negotiated like con artists, and scientists who reverse-engineered alien technology like they were debugging poorly written software. He was beginning to suspect that humanity's threat potential was considerably higher than anyone had calculated. "Update the assessment," he ordered grimly, "and send a priority message to Hegemony Command. We're going to need a new playbook." 6 months after the Hegemony's routine pacification operation began, Admiral Omnixius found himself staring at reports that read like science fiction, written by someone having a particularly creative nervous breakdown. The species that should have been gratefully accepting cosmic guidance had instead turned the entire invasion into what human military analysts were calling the galaxy's most expensive educational exchange program. The turning point came on a Tuesday, which was somehow perfectly appropriate for a species that had managed to make even their rebellion mundane and extraordinary simultaneous. Evelyn Hartford's philosophical discussions with the Ethereals had evolved into what she now called aggressive cultural anthropology. She had mapped not just hegemony communication protocols, but their entire political structure, complete with bureaucratic weak points, interspecies tensions, and what appeared to be the galactic equivalent of office politics. "You know," she mentioned casually during her latest session with a particularly pompous ethereal entity, "it's fascinating how the Nexus Collective always defers to your species on matters of cosmic philosophy, but they control all the actual technology, and the wisdom clouds provide strategic oversight, but they're never actually consulted on implementation decisions. It's almost like your perfect alliance has some structural tension." The Ethereal's light patterns flickered in what Hartford had learned to recognize as the energy being equivalent of suddenly realizing you've said too much to someone who was paying entirely too much attention. Meanwhile, Bennet Hayes had moved far beyond reverse engineering alien technology. He had improved it, simplified it, and then began the process that would haunt hegemony engineers for centuries. He started teaching it to other humans. The species that had been dismissed as primitive was now producing hybrid technologies that outperformed hegemony's standard equipment, while being cheap enough to mass-produce in converted automotive factories. "The beautiful thing about human engineering," Hayes explained to his rapidly expanding team of technicians, "is that we're too ignorant to know what's supposed to be impossible. They built these systems assuming everyone would follow their rules, or not everyone." The breakthrough came when Hayes's team cracked the hegemony's quantum communication network. Not only could they intercept and decode alien military communications, they could inject their own messages into the system. The psychological warfare potential was staggering, but humans being humans, the first message they sent was a formal complaint about the invasion's environmental impact, filed with what appeared to be the Hegemony's equivalent of a customer service department. Colonel Diana Frost had been quietly orchestrating the masterpiece, while the aliens focused on the obvious resistance movements and the scientific intelligence gathering. She had been preparing humanity's real response, a coordinated counterattack that would exploit every weakness the aliens had unknowingly revealed, and every advantage humanity had gained. The beauty of our position, Frost explained to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in what had become a daily briefing on the impossible, is that they still think we're the same species they encountered 6 months ago. They have no concept of how quickly humans adapt when we're motivated. They're fighting the species they invaded, not the species they created. The counterattack began with what historians would later call the Great Confusion. Using Hartford's political intelligence and Hayes's communication hacks, humanity began injecting carefully crafted disinformation into hegemony command structures. Reports of human surrender from sectors where resistance was actually intensifying. Technical specifications that were 90% accurate, but contained subtle flaws that would cause system failures at crucial moments. Most devastatingly, diplomatic communications that appeared to be from various hegemony species, criticizing each other's handling of the primitive species problem. The Ethereals received intercepted reports suggesting the Nexus Collective considered them inefficient and outdated. The collective intercepted communications, indicating the wisdom clouds thought their logical processes were fundamentally flawed. The clouds discovered evidence that the other species were plotting to exclude them from future operations. Within weeks, the perfect unity of the hegemony began developing cracks. The alliance that had held together for 3 million years started experiencing what their diplomatic files would later classify as unprecedented interspecies friction over operational procedure. In reality, they were having their first major argument, and humanity was providing the ammunition for all sides. But the real masterstroke was Hartford's diplomatic gambit. Using her comprehensive understanding of hegemony politics and humanity's natural talent for creative problem-solving, she began negotiations with individual alien species, rather than the hegemony as a whole. Not negotiations for surrender, but negotiations for mutual benefit. The thing is, she explained to an increasingly nervous ethereal delegation, we're not actually opposed to galactic civilization. We're opposed to bad management. Your species has obviously transcended physical limitations and achieved remarkable philosophical insight. Why are you letting the collective handle all the interesting technical decisions? Wouldn't a direct partnership be more enlightening? Similar conversations were happening with each species. The Nexus Collective was offered human innovation and creative problem-solving in exchange for advanced manufacturing techniques. The wisdom clouds were presented with the fascinating philosophical implications of working with a species that somehow combined logic and chaos into functional solutions. Each species began to wonder why they needed the others when humans offered everything they wanted with considerably less bureaucratic overhead. Admiral Omnixius watched his perfect invasion dissolve into political chaos, technological inadequacy, and diplomatic disaster. The species that should have been conquered was instead conquering his alliance through the simple expedient of offering each member something better than what they had. The final blow came when humanity made its official response to the invasion, not through any single government, but through a coordinated global broadcast that reached every corner of human civilization, and thanks to Hayes's communication hacks, every ship in the hegemony fleet. The message was simple, devastating, and utterly perfectly human. Thank you for the educational opportunity. We've learned a great deal about galactic civilization, and we're excited to join as equal partners rather than junior members. However, we've noticed some inefficiencies in your current system, and would like to propose some improvements. We've prepared a comprehensive analysis of your organizational structure, along with suggested optimization. Also, we've taken the liberty of upgrading your technology to more user-friendly specifications. Please find attached our revised terms for joining Galactic Society. We look forward to a productive partnership. P.S. We've prepared welcome packages for each of your species, including cultural exchange materials and local cuisine. We think you'll particularly enjoy the coffee. The Hegemony fleet departed Earth's system with unseemly haste, leaving behind a hastily transmitted galactic bulletin that would become legendary. Warning,
Species designation human, demonstrates anomalous adaptation characteristics. Do not engage without extensive preparation. Capable of weaponizing curiosity, friendship, and improvement. Approach with extreme caution, or preferably not at all. Note, their beverage called coffee may be addictive to silicon-based lifeform. 3 million years of successful galactic management had been undone by a species that treated invasion like a learning opportunity and responded to conquest with a customer satisfaction survey. The Hegemony had encountered their first species that got stronger when pressed, smarter when challenged, and more dangerous when educated. Humanity had passed its cosmic examination, not by being the species the aliens expected, but by being exactly the species they were: curious, stubborn, adaptable, and absolutely impossible to break. The galaxy, as it was about to discover, would never be quite the same again.